The air is heavy, a thick blanket of West African heat mixed with the scent of damp earth and the salt spray of the Atlantic. Inside the grand ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel, one of history's most significant handshakes is taking place. On one side stand the leaders of 46 nations from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, countries that have only recently tasted the air of independence, their flags still crisp and new. On the other side stand their former masters, the representatives of the European Economic Community. Flashbulbs pop, champagne corks fly. The document being signed is called the Lomé Convention. European diplomats describe it as a partnership of equals. African leaders present it to their people as the key to economic sovereignty. The promise was seductive. Europe would buy their raw materials, their sugar, their coffee, their minerals, at preferential prices, and in return, Europe would provide massive development aid. But deep within the layers of that parchment, written in the invisible ink of geopolitical necessity, was a clause that no one mentioned during the speeches. Europe had withdrawn its soldiers, but it had no intention of withdrawing its control. The tanks were being replaced by paragraphs. The colonial governors were being replaced by trade auditors. Imagine waking up and believing you are finally free, that you no longer answer to anyone. But then you realize that the price of your sugar, the capacity of your factories, and the value of the currency in your pocket are still decided thousands of miles away in a gray office in Brussels. Is this independence, or is it just the jailer changing his uniform? After 1945, Europe was a graveyard of ambition. Britain and France had won the war on paper, but in reality they were bankrupt. They no longer had the money or the military might to hold on to their vast overseas territories. However, there was a desperate problem: the rebuild. Imagine the Brussels of the 1960s. The city is a forest of rising cranes and cold gray concrete. Inside the offices of the newly formed commission, the air is thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the heavy smoke of expensive cigars. Outside, the rain slicks the cobblestones, but inside, men in tailored suits are hunched over massive maps. These maps no longer show military zones. They show trade quotas and customs preferences. Can you hear the sound of the paper? The frantic rustle of thousands of pages of technical specifications, tariff tables, and agricultural subsidies. These papers were heavier than the iron chains of the 19th century. In those smoke-filled rooms, the word aid actually meant dependency. Europe was giving these countries money, but that money came with a golden handcuff. It could only be used to buy European goods, European machines, and European expertise. It was as if a shopkeeper gave you a loan but forced you to spend every cent back in his own shop. The profit never left the building. Why the sugar pact? Because sugar is the purest, most tragic symbol of this relationship. For nations like Mauritius, Fiji, or Jamaica, sugar was not just a crop, it was the entire spine of their economy. Europe made them a promise under the Lomé Convention. We will not compete with your cane sugar. We will buy a fixed amount of it every year at a guaranteed price, far above the world market rate. It sounded like a miracle, but it was a trap. This guaranteed price incentivized these nations to produce nothing else. They didn't build factories. They didn't diversify their crops. They didn't invest in technology. They simply planted more and more sugar. But what would happen if one day Europe decided it no longer needed their sugar? Or what if Europe started subsidizing its own beet sugar to the point where the guaranteed price became a joke? In that moment, the sweet promise would become a death warrant. London wanted the benefits of Europe, but didn't want to lose the influence of the empire. The Lomé Convention was the solution, a bridge between the old British Empire and the new European project. Britain dragged its former colonies into the deal like wagons hitched to a train. But the brakes were no longer in London. They were in the hands of the technocrats in Brussels. Imagine a sugar plantation in the Caribbean. The sun is a white-hot blade against the backs of the workers. The air is filled with the cloying, sickly sweet scent of burnt cane, a smell that is almost like rotting fruit. You hear the rhythmic thwack-thwack of the machetes cutting through the thick stalks. The worker in that field has no idea that his harvest is headed for a teacup in London or a laboratory in Brussels. He only knows his daily wage. But thousands of miles away, in a climate-controlled room, a bureaucrat signs a decree that reduces the sugar quota by 2%. Can you hear the sound of that signature? The wet, sliding sound of ink on paper? A sound so small, yet it carries the power to starve 10,000 families. The contrast between the sweating man in the sun and the dry man in the office is the true definition of the Sugar Pact. The great illusion of the Lomé Convention was development aid. Europe flooded the ACP nations with billions of ECUs, the predecessor to the euro. But where did that money actually go? The statistics tell a brutal story. For every $100 of aid provided, $80 returned to Europe in the form of consultancy fees, the purchase of European machinery, or the hiring of European firms. Europe was taking money out of its left pocket and putting it into its right pocket, all while making the African and Caribbean nations feel grateful for the gift. Real independence is the power to spend your own money. But the ACP nations could only be as wealthy as.
This time, the conversation wasn't just about sugar and coffee. It was about good governance, democracy, and human rights. It sounds noble, doesn't it? But in the hands of the European Commission, these terms became a lever for political interference. If a nation tried to protect its own domestic industry by placing a tariff on European milk or European steel, Europe would declare their governance to be failing and freeze the aid. This was the peak of contractual colonialism. There was no longer any need for soldiers on the ground when a human rights report could collapse a nation's budget from a distance. Imagine trying to build a textile factory in Nigeria or Ghana. You have the cotton, you have the workers, you have the will. But under the rules of the Cotonou Agreement and the subsequent economic partnership agreements, you cannot place a tariff on second-hand European clothing or cheap European textiles. Free trade demands that your doors stay open. The result? Your factory closes before it even opens. Your workers remain unemployed, and you remain dependent on European humanitarian aid to feed the very people who should have been working in your mills. The rhythm is always the same. Europe takes the raw material, processes it, and sells the finished product back to you. The gears of your own progress remain rusted and still. Can you smell the rust? The cold, metallic scent of a factory that has been silent for a decade. That is the smell of a murdered dream. Let us meet an old sugar planter in Mauritius. His name is Amadou. His father was a slave on these lands, and his grandfather was a colonial laborer. Amadou was part of the generation that cheered in 1975, believing that Lomé was the beginning of a golden age. Now, in the twilight of his life, Amadou stands in his field alone.
Smell the air in his small house. It smells of wood smoke and damp stone. Amadou's grandson does not want to work the fields. He is looking toward the horizon, toward the Mediterranean, dreaming of a life in the very Europe that ruined his grandfather's livelihood. Europe controlled the sugar with contracts, and now it controls the people with visa walls. Amadou looks at the stack of papers, the ACP agreements that he once held like a holy book. Now they are just debt notices. Can you hear the sound of the paper? The dry, brittle rustle of a man's life turning to ash. This sound is the final act of a 40-year deception. In the last decade, a new player has arrived at the table: China. Beijing does not come with human rights lectures or governance conditions. It comes with a simple offer: I will build your roads, I will build your ports, and in exchange, I will take your minerals. Europe is in a panic. The backyard they have controlled for centuries is slipping away. Now Brussels is talking about new agreements, about global gateway projects to compete with China. But the African leaders are no longer the inexperienced youths of 1975. They have seen the Sugar Pact for what it was. But in this new game of giants, will Africa finally find its voice? Or is it simply trading one master for another? The ACP agreements were a masterclass in colonial conscience cleansing. They ensured the flow of raw materials while maintaining the moral high ground of aid. It was not a partnership, it was a service contract. Independence is not an image on a flag, it is the power to tear up the contract. Today, many nations are finally questioning this toxic relation.
The next time you walk into a supermarket and buy a bag of sugar, remember that you aren't just buying a sweetener. You are buying a piece of a story that spans from the ballrooms of Togo to the gray offices of Brussels. You are buying the unrecorded labor of millions and the calculated maneuvers of diplomats. Colonialism did not end, it just changed its medium. It stopped being written in blood and started being written in 500-page trade agreements. And those agreements leave a scar that is deeper than any sword. The Sugar Pact allowed Europe to control the people outside its borders. But what did that same Europe do to the people it invited inside? In 1948, a ship called the Empire Windrush arrived in London, carrying the sons of the Empire. They were told they were British. They were told they were coming home. But why, decades later, did the British government turn on its own children? Why were the people who rebuilt London suddenly declared illegal? That is the story of our next investigation: the Windrush betrayal, the Empire's war on its own.